to talk a little bit more about the visit and what is likely to be accomplished by it. President Ramaphosa's working visit to Mozambique. We're joined now by Professor Dirk Kotze from the Department of Political Science at UNISA, the University of South Africa. Professor, very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. As we mentioned, President Cyril Ramaphosa is going there in his capacity as a president of South Africa. But there is also the very important anniversary, the 53rd commemoration of the assassination of Dr. Eduardo Mondlane, the founding president of Frelimo and former president of Mozambique. But beyond this, is there any pressing issue that you think President Filipe Nyusi would like to put on the table with his South African counterpart?
Well, I think the second part, which received now quite a lot of attention, is the fact that President Ramaphosa went there also in his capacity as the chairperson of the SADC Organ on Politics, Defence and Security. That's the component of SADC that's responsible for the security matters, the military and related issues, political issues. So in that sense, President Ramaphosa is on the one hand there as South African president, but also as the chairperson, the SADC chairperson of the organ. And I think it's in the second capacity that Mozambique really wants to have a discussion with President Ramaphosa, because there appears to be some progress being made in Cabo Delgado as a result of the work that has been done, first of all, by the Rwandese military forces that were there, and then later on followed by SADC. South Africa has a component of about 1,500 troops in that area. There's also troops as part of the SADC group from Angola and from Tanzania and Lesotho and Botswana. So it is a multinational force that's there, but it is primarily the South African component that's driving it. And with the Rwandese and the South African cooperation, they had some successes already. But I think the fact that South Africa has so much interest also in what happens in the northern part of Mozambique and offshore, specifically the development of the gas fields there, the fact that a pipeline has already been established to Sasol in Mpumalanga, as well as we know, also the Kahore Bassa that provides electricity to Eskom. So there's several elements of interest in that part of Mozambique.
All right, so let's tear them apart so that we can focus on some of them individually, Professor. You mentioned the deployment of Rwandan forces in the Cabo Delgado province now. Some eyebrows were raised at the time that there was a more involved approach taken by Rwanda, whereas some people would have expected South Africa, though it is involved, to have should I say, a wider deployment to Mozambique. Just share your thoughts about that. Was it more involved, Rwanda, in repelling the insurgency, or was it more strategic for South Africa to lend a helping hand but not get too involved in this aspect of the military repel?
Well, I think there's a number of matters that's relevant here. Initially, the relationship between South Africa and Mozambique was not necessarily as warm as it should have been. I think one should remind ourselves, for example, about that incident of Robert McBride, who was at that stage a senior staff member of the State Security Agency, and who was suspended by President Ramaphosa, because of the embarrassment that was caused by the fact that South African drones or intelligence drones were active in the airspace of Mozambique without his knowledge. There was therefore a serious objection made by Mozambique for the fact of this South African presence in Mozambican territory without an official diplomatic agreement about that. So the relationship between South Africa and Mozambique at that stage was not as warm as it should have been. And in that I would almost call a vacuum that existed at that stage. Therefore, Rwanda moved in. And they moved in because initially there were private security, military security companies active in the north in order to quell the insurgents or the radicals in the north. First of all, the Russian group, the so-called Wagner group, and they were seriously set back by the insurgents, and quite a number of them were killed by them. So they withdrew ultimately, and then South African private military companies or firms moved in, and for some stage stayed there with the knowledge of Mozambique, with the cooperation of Mozambique, but their contract came to an end, and then it was that Rwanda moved in the absence of South Africa. I think the South African government and the Defence Force specifically were not yet prepared for this. South Africa, the Defence Force is very much committed to other peacekeeping forces. For example, in the DRC, earlier on it was also in Burundi, much earlier on in Darfur and other places. So there's not necessarily a lot of capacity to deploy this. This deployment is not a peacekeeping deployment. It is more of an offensive deployment in the northern part of Mozambique. And the troops the peacekeeping troops are not necessarily prepared for this type of offensive or this type of campaign. So they had to be trained and prepared much better for that before they could move in. And that is why I would say that the Rwandese therefore moved in the absence of the South Africa's presence then.
So in light of what you're saying, Professor, the covert intelligence operations in Mozambique, which you said raised the ire of the Mozambicans, and the rumours, in fact, it's been established that of so-called mercenary groups, private companies from South Africans, led by South Africans, their presence in Mozambique, which has often been accused of trying to derail the government of the day. So what kind of conversations lay ahead for the two deputy ministers that are accompanying President Ramaphosa? That is the Deputy Minister of DIRCO, Candice Mashego Dlamini, the Deputy Minister of Defence and Military Veterans, Thabang Makwetla, in light of these tensions that have existed in the past. But considering the fact that Mozambique is a neighbour and we wouldn't want to unwittingly export that insecurity onto South African territory.
Yes, that is definitely the case. But South Africa doesn't want to act on its own, and that is why it is done in the capacity of SADC. It's not South African troops who are there in their capacity as part of the South African National Defence Force. They are there as part of the SADC standby force. And in that context, President Ramaphosa is there because he's, as I mentioned earlier on, at the moment the chairperson of that organ. So I think South Africa tries as much as possible not to be seen as sort of a military presence on its own, because some people, especially in Mozambique and other African countries, might feel quite uncomfortable with a too assertive South African presence. I think what is also necessary to understand is that there's a growing sort of presence of South Africa also in other fields. For example, the export of coal from the South African coal mines is increasing massively through Maputo at the moment, and it's going to China mainly. And the reason for that is because the Chinese imports from Australia came more or less to an end because of their diplomatic problems that they experienced. So it opened up huge opportunities for the South African trade through Maputo of coal. At the same time, many other aspects like South African tourism going to Mozambique is also increasing all the time. So that relations between South Africa and Mozambique has quite dramatically improved. I don't want to present it as if it's at the moment problematic. It was earlier on, because of the incidents that I mentioned, it was more problematic. But the fact that President Ramaphosa was invited by the Mozambican president for a working visit is already an indication of that the relationship, the bilateral relationship, is much better than before.
In fact, the South African government characterizes the relationship as a cordial one, a fraternal one. So how to best deepen ties, which you've already mentioned? We have a lot of South African citizens that work in Mozambique. There are a lot of Mozambican migrants here in South Africa. You mentioned the Sasol project, the Kahora Basa project as well, just in terms of hydroelectric power, which we have been cooperating with the Mozambicans on. What is still left to do, and how can we improve those relations, especially in terms of economic ties, when there has been so many tensions, especially about migrant various migrants in South Africa, foreign migrants. There are different types of foreign internationals in South Africa. And we've seen the backlash from South Africans who feel that the fight for scant resources has really deepened the tension. So these discussions would obviously have to be had. Talk to me about how can we improve that, and what should we be prioritizing?
Well, we all know about the African Free Trade Agreement that was concluded and now being implemented. And I think this is one of the areas where it also applies very much to the relationship between South Africa and Mozambique, like it also applies to South Africa and Zimbabwe and other neighboring countries. So in that sense, the flow of migration between the two countries should be still looked at in terms of making it easier for that to take place. As you indicated, there are quite a lot of Mozambican citizens already in South Africa. We see it, for example, at the time of Mozambican elections, that the two main parties in Mozambican parties actually campaign inside South Africa amongst their citizens for the time of elections. So there is an integrated nature in that relationship, either diplomatic and otherwise, between the two countries. And I think that those are the aspects that will have to be improved. I think from Mozambican side, they will say it is an uneven relationship, that South Africa dominates this relationship, the economic and trade relationship, and more opportunities should ultimately be created for Mozambican trade to South Africa also, and that the balance between the two countries in economic terms, in terms of interaction, should become more even and more favorable for Mozambique than what it is at the moment. There's very little in the form of, for example, flow of goods from the Mozambican side to the South African side. It's very much in the one direction, that's from South Africa to Mozambique. Okay. But I think what is also interesting about it is that Mozambique, because it's a Lusophone country to a large extent, also brings in some other dimensions that Angola, for example, do have, but not the other Anglophone countries. And that is something which means that it links them also more with the Indian Ocean and the Indian Ocean Rim Association. South Africa is part of it, and Mozambique is, Tanzania, and many other countries. And that opens up the trade with the ocean trade, the marine trade, which South Africa hasn't yet exploited enough. Okay,
just a quick and final question, Professor Kotze. They are also set to discuss, the two leaders, closer cooperation, collaboration on multilateral issues. So I want to look at regional issues in particular, especially when it has to do with insecurity, the growing presence of what are said to be radical Islamic groups or insurgents in Mozambique. We've seen a number of coups in the western part of the region. But more importantly, it's been warned several times that you have some of these militant groups moving down the continent towards the south, seeking to grow their influence. South Africa has cut its teeth in terms of peacekeeping in the DRC, as you mentioned, the largest peacekeeping force it's ever had. But there are lessons to be learnt there. So what issues can the two countries converge on in improving the state of insecurity in the southern parts of the region, but also not to get too involved in parties' foreign interests that then cause divisions because of what they're seeking to do in individual countries?
Yes, it is obviously in South Africa's interest that the current instability or threat that exists in the northern part of Mozambique, that it doesn't come more south towards South Africa, or more ultimately also moving in a westward direction towards Malawi or Zimbabwe and ultimately South Africa. So it should be confined to that northern part of Mozambique, and hopefully that it can be ultimately dealt with. Many observers and researchers are saying ultimately it's an issue that must be resolved between Tanzania and Mozambique, that it is more of an issue that not comes from Tanzania, but there's more of a commonality in the matters and the issues that they are sharing. So the solution for this situation is more dependent on how Tanzania is going to approach it than, for example, South Africa. Now, Tanzania is also part of SADC, the Southern African Development Community. So ultimately, it becomes an issue that must be dealt with within this regional organization to a large extent. South Africa does not want to become involved directly in situations where there's radical Islamist groups, whether it is in Somalia or other places, or for example, the West Africa. South Africa, especially from a military point of view, peacekeeping point of view, has not been involved in that. And I think it is in order to avoid, for example, the predicament of a country like Kenya, who have peacekeepers in Somalia, and it's spilled over into their areas as a form of a retribution almost.
Okay.
And I think South Africa tries to avoid that at all costs.
Thank you so much for your time and your insights. Really appreciate it. Professor Dirk Kotze, he is indeed in charge of the Department of Political Science at the University of South Africa.